Imagine a scenario where 120 luxury homes have suddenly materialized on your land with startling speed. Envision the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, with a self-satisfied grin. Picture lawyers in their expensive suits chuckling at what they perceive as your naive error. They overlooked, however, a single crucial detail. For 15 years, I have been a forensic accountant specializing in property fraud. They were unaware that each brick they positioned was, in fact, constructing the walls of their own future prison. I will now explain how I transformed their avarice into the most gratifying legal snare imaginable. The morning I got back from a 6-month consulting engagement in London, the Arizona sun felt particularly warm and welcoming on my skin. I was Brian Jordan, a 45-year-old man, finally prepared to settle down on the 50-acre property my Aunt Margaret had bequeathed to me. The Uber driver repeatedly glanced at me in his rearview mirror as we neared what was supposed to be vacant desert terrain. "Sir, are you certain this is the correct address? This appears to be an entirely new development," he remarked, reducing his speed. My heart plunged as I witnessed row upon row of uniform beige houses where my aunt's fields of wildflowers ought to have been. A total of 120 homes, featuring perfectly manicured lawns and HOA-sanctioned mailboxes, occupied my property. The Emerald Heights community sign seemed to taunt me with its immaculate gold lettering. I settled the fare with the driver and proceeded directly to the sales office, where an enthusiastic blonde realtor leaped to her feet to welcome me. "Welcome to Emerald Heights. Are you inquiring about our Phase 2 homes? We're already 70% sold." I presented my property deed. "I am interested in understanding why there are houses on my land." Her smile faltered for a moment before she composed herself. "Oh, you must be Mr. Jordan. Melanie Ross, our HOA president, has been anticipating your arrival. She mentioned you might have some questions about the development agreement." The sales office itself was a shrine to suburban extravagance, boasting marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls adorned with architectural plans for an even more expansive development. Phase 2, it seemed, was slated to include a golf course and a country club, also on my property. The realtor, whose name tag identified her as Brittany, typed nervously at her computer. "Mrs. Ross instructed me to send you straight up when you arrived. Her office is located on the second floor of the administration building." She gestured toward a polished glass edifice that resembled a corporate headquarters more than a typical HOA office. As I made my way through the development, I observed the kinds of details my forensic accountants I instinctively registered. The streets bore the names of precious stones: Sapphire Lane, Ruby Court, Diamond Drive. Every house shared the same beige stucco finish, with only minor differences in trim color. The landscaping was pristine but devoid of character, with not a single leaf astray. Residents were out walking their dogs or jogging, and all of them eyed me with suspicion. I was unmistakably an outsider on what had once been my own land. I met Melanie in her luxurious office, where she smugly asserted that the development was entirely legitimate. She was 52, with impeccably coiffed silver hair and the predatory smile of a person who had successfully gotten away with major transgressions before. Positioned behind her desk were her law degree from Stanford and several civic awards, all strategically placed to intimidate her visitors. "Brian, I'm so pleased you could finally join us," she crooned, pushing a thick folder across her mahogany desk. "As you'll see, we dispatched numerous notices to your registered address concerning the development plans." Upon receiving no reply, we moved forward in accordance with the HOA bylaws your aunt consented to when Emerald Heights was initially founded in 1998. She opened the folder, displaying page after page of legal papers, certified mail receipts, and public announcements. Everything was handled by the book, I can assure you. "But which registered address?" I inquired, leafing through the documents. My blood turned to ice when I saw it. 1223 Maple Drive, my aunt's former residence, which had been torn down 2 years prior following her death. The certified mail receipts all indicated delivery attempted, no such address. Melanie's eyes held a glint of satisfaction. "The address on file with the HOA. We adhered to proper protocol, Brian. Every notice, every deadline, every chance for you to raise an objection, all were correctly documented and mailed to that address." She settled back into her leather chair. "I realize this may be a lot to process, but the development is now a fait accompli. Perhaps we could talk about a compensation package for your cooperation. I analyzed her face, taking note of a subtle twitch at the edge of her mouth, a tell I had observed in numerous fraud investigations. You were aware that address was no longer in use, I stated calmly. Her smile remained fixed. We are obligated to utilize the address on file. It is not our duty to locate property owners who neglect to update their contact details. She produced another document. Your aunt signed this HOA agreement in 1998, which clearly stipulates that all official correspondence would be dispatched to the address of record. I rose to my feet, maintaining my poker face, a skill I had perfected over years of investigating financial crimes. I will require some time to go over these documents with my legal counsel. Melanie's smile grew broader. Of course, but I must inform you that contesting this would be both costly and pointless. We have the support of Morrison Keller and Associates. You may have heard of them. I had. They were the legal juggernauts who had defeated 3 environmental organizations attempting to halt a pipeline project the previous year. As I departed from her office, I caught her remark to her assistant, Hilfold. They always do. Walking back through the development, I absorbed more details. There were security cameras at every intersection, a private security vehicle on patrol, and an entrance gate complete with a guard station. This was more than a simple housing development. It was a fortress. My aunt's 50 acres had been converted into a regulated environment where every facet of life was controlled. I paused at the location where her cherished oak tree had once stood. It was now replaced by a decorative fountain encircled by benches bolted to concrete slabs. That evening, I was in my hotel room, enveloped by documents and my laptop, engaged in what I do best, tracing the flow of money. There was something about Melanie's self-assurance that troubled me. It wasn't merely arrogance. It was the conviction of someone who had successfully executed this scheme before. I began by examining public records, and in just a few hours, I uncovered my first clue. Melanie Ross was formerly known as Melanie Ross Hutchinson. Her attorney registration had been suspended in 2016 for conduct involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. The plot was growing more intricate, and I hadn't even begun to investigate the HOA's financial affairs yet. My phone vibrated with a text from an unfamiliar number. Heard you're back in town. If you want the real story about Emerald Heights, meet me at Java Junction tomorrow at 10 a.m. A friend. I smiled. In my line of work, anonymous friends typically signified someone with a burdened conscience or a grievance to air. In either case, they frequently possessed the most valuable information. I sent back a concise, "I'll be there," and went back to my research. By 3 a.m., I had identified 15 other properties that had, under mysterious circumstances, fallen under the control of Emerald Heights in the last 5 years. The methodology was consistent. Elderly owners, heirs residing out of state, and invariably, those notices dispatched to obsolete addresses. Java Junction was a small coffee shop on the edge of town, the type of establishment where the regulars knew one another and newcomers were conspicuous. The location was deliberately selected, I surmised, distant enough from Emerald Heights to elude surveillance, yet bustling enough to offer anonymity. I got there early, ordered a black coffee, and selected a corner booth that provided a clear view of the entrance. The morning clientele was a blend of construction workers getting breakfast and retirees debating world affairs over bottomless coffee. Precisely at 10 a.m., a young woman dressed in a sharp navy suit entered, anxiously surveying the room. When our eyes connected, she gave a slight nod and came over. "Mr. Jordan? I'm Allison West. I believe I can assist you with your problem." She slid into the booth opposite me, her hands shaking slightly as she placed her briefcase on the table. From this close, I could discern the dark circles beneath her eyes, which were partially concealed by expertly applied makeup. This was a person who had not been sleeping peacefully. "I used to be employed by Melanie," she started, her voice hushed. Fresh out of law school, I believed I had secured my ideal position with a prosperous attorney. She was brilliant, charismatic, everything I aspired to be. Allison retrieved a folder. Then I uncovered her true activities. The Emerald Heights HOA is not merely a homeowners association. It's an elaborate property acquisition operation. Melanie identifies vulnerable properties, employs obscure HOA bylaws to legitimize takeovers, and then collaborates with developers to resell the land for huge profits. She opened the folder, exposing meticulously arranged documents, emails, financial statements, and internal communications. I began to see inconsistencies about 6 months into my employment. properties were being incorporated into the HOA's jurisdiction without proper approval. Elderly homeowners were signing papers they didn't comprehend. Signatures on crucial documents were forged. Her tone became firm. When I presented my worries to Melanie, she just laughed. She told me I was being naive and that this was how business operated in the real world. I leaned in. Why come to me? Why not take this to the authorities? Allison's laugh was tinged with bitterness. I did try, but Melanie is well connected. She has judges, city council members, and even some FBI contacts in her network. When I threatened to unmask her, she had me blacklisted. She claimed I was a disgruntled former employee making baseless allegations. Now, no law firm in 3 states will hire me. She pushed the folder towards me. But I retained copies of everything, including evidence that she was aware your aunt had passed away when she mailed those notices. She produced a specific email, dated 3 months before I was informed of the development. Examine this conversation between Melanie and her assistant. She clearly states that the old woman is dead and directs her team to proceed with mailing notices to the defunct address. She even makes a joke about it, calling it fishing in a dry pond. I reviewed the email thread, my fury escalating with every word. The callousness was astounding. The documents were incriminating. Email exchanges between Melanie and her developer partner, Jim the Hammer Harrison, about how to accelerate the seizure of my land, and financial records indicating millions in offshore accounts. The most compelling item, however, was a technical report concerning environmental evaluations. What is this about soil contamination? I inquired. Allison smiled for the first time. That is your trump card. Melanie was in such a hurry to build that she bypassed proper environmental testing. Those houses are constructed on land that required remediation first. Every single building permit was acquired through fraudulent means. There's more, Allison went on, extracting another stack of documents. Your aunt wasn't just a random victim. She had been challenging Melanie for years. Look at these letters. Correspondence between your aunt and various regulatory bodies. Complaints submitted to the State Bar Association. Even a private investigator's report. I quickly read through the papers, recognizing my aunt's familiar handwriting on letter after letter. She had understood precisely what was occurring and had been compiling a case. Over the subsequent 2 hours, Allison detailed the entire scheme. The HOA would pinpoint properties with owners who were absent or deceased, mail legally mandated notices to addresses they knew were invalid, and then use the absence of a response to assert abandonment rights based on an obscure clause in the original HOA charter. They would collaborate with Jim Harrison's development firm, construct rapidly using inferior materials and shortcuts, and then sell the properties to unsuspecting buyers before anyone could contest the legality of the takeover. They've employed this method on 15 other properties, she stated. But you are different. You possess the expertise to dismantle this, and crucially, you returned before they could sell all the houses. The timing is vital, she clarified, presenting a timeline she had prepared. Melanie typically waits at least a year after taking possession before anyone discovers what has transpired. By that point, she has sold most of the units, established a convoluted web of ownership, and made it nearly impossible to reverse the transactions. But you arrived just 6 months into the process. She has sold some units, but not enough to render the situation irreversible. That is why she is panicking. Why should I believe you? I asked, scrutinizing her face. This could all be a sophisticated trap. Allison met my gaze unflinchingly. Because I am the reason you inherited that land. Your aunt was my mentor in law school. She was aware of Melanie's plans and specifically altered her will to leave the property to someone who could fight back. She always said you were the most intelligent person in the family, that you would perceive what others overlooked. She pulled out a handwritten letter. She left this for you in case a situation like this arose. My aunt's familiar script blurred as I read, Dear Brian, if you are reading this, it means Melanie Ross has executed her plan. I have observed her circling like a vulture for years, awaiting my death. The land is not merely property, it is evidence. Look beneath the old oak tree near the creek. I have buried something that will assist you in bringing her down. Trust Allison. She is one of the good ones. Love, Aunt Margaret. I folded the letter with care. It seems we have some excavating to do. There is something else you should be aware of, Allison added as we got ready to depart. Melanie is not acting alone. She is part of a network that spans several states. The Emerald Heights model has been duplicated in Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah. They target retirement communities, areas with aging demographics, anywhere they can take advantage of property laws and HOA regulations. Your aunt discovered this, which is why she became such a menace. She wasn't just safeguarding her own land. She was attempting to expose a multi-state criminal operation. That afternoon, equipped with shovels and resolve, Allison and I located my aunt's insurance policy, a waterproof container holding original HOA documents, recorded conversations, and a diary chronicling every suspicious event she had witnessed. The true bombshell, however, was a collection of geological surveys from 1997, which indicated natural gas deposits beneath the property. That's why Melanie desires the land so desperately, Allison whispered. It's not just about the residences. She intends to sell the mineral rights to Excelsior Energy for $50 million once she gains complete control. I dedicated the evening to constructing a comprehensive timeline of Melanie's fraudulent activities. The pattern was undeniable, but patterns alone are insufficient for a court of law. I required admissible evidence, and I needed Melanie to incriminate herself. It was then that I had a flash of inspiration. Allison, how would you feel about playing the role of a double agent? I inquired. She arched an eyebrow. What do you have in mind? I detailed my strategy. Allison would contact Melanie, asserting that she wanted back in and could assist in managing the Brian Jordan problem. In the meantime, I would act the part of the overwhelmed heir, prepared to settle for a fraction of the land's worth. The HOA meeting took place in the community center, a lustrous building that my money had evidently financed. The room was filled with residents, the majority of whom glared at me as if I were the antagonist in this saga. Melanie stood at the lectern, exuding confidence in her power suit. Thank you all for attending on such short notice, she started. As you are aware, we have a situation concerning the ownership claims asserted by Mr. Brian Jordan. She motioned towards me. While we are sympathetic to his confusion, the reality is that this development was constructed legally and in good faith. I stood up, performing my role flawlessly. I just want what is equitable, I stated, allowing a slight tremor in my voice. My aunt bequeathed this land to me, and now there are houses on it. I have no wish to displace families, but surely some compensation is owed. The crowd murmured, some voices sympathetic to me, most against. Melanie's smile was condescending. Of course, Brian. We are willing to offer you 200,000. Why? 200,000 for a potential claim you might possess. That is more than fair, given that the development was approved via the correct procedures. 200,000. I echoed, then glanced down at my papers as if weighing the offer. The land was valued at a minimum of $5 million undeveloped. Melanie's eyes flashed. Was worth, Mr. Jordan. Past tense. The circumstances have changed. At that moment, Jim Harrison rose from the front row. He was a large man with a complexion that suggested golf courses rather than construction zones. Listen, buddy, he drawled, you can accept the offer, or you can waste the next decade in court. Your call. I allowed the silence to linger, then took out my phone. Before I make a decision, there is something everyone here ought to hear. I played the recording Allison had made the previous day during her meeting with Melanie. Melanie's voice resonated through the room. Of course, I knew the old bat was dead. That's why I sent the notices there. Brian Jordan was in London, likely sipping tea and eating crumpets. By the time he realized what was happening, we'd have everything secured. The room descended into chaos. Residents began shouting questions. Melanie's face turned from red to stark white. That's taken out of context, she stammered. But I was not finished. I also possess copies of the authentic environmental reports. The ones indicating contamination levels 3 times higher than the legal limit. The ones you concealed from these families who purchased homes here. Now the residents were on their feet, clamoring for answers. Jim Harrison attempted to exit through a side door but was blocked by Connell Lewis, my next-door neighbor from childhood, who had become a resident of Emerald Heights. I don't think so, Jim, Connell stated with firmness. We all need to hear this. Melanie tried to reassert control. This is absurd. He has clearly fabricated these recordings. I will be filing charges for defamation first thing in the morning. But uncertainty was spreading through the room like a contagion. I produced more documents. Speaking of legal matters, is anyone aware that HOA funds have been utilized to cover Melanie's personal legal defense in 3 separate fraud cases? Or that the construction firm that built your homes has declared bankruptcy twice under different names? The meeting spiraled into chaos. Melanie retreated to her office with Jim following closely. Several residents surrounded me, pressing for more information. How extensive is this? Inquired a young father holding a baby. Are our homes safe? I selected my words with care. I am collaborating with the authorities to uncover the full extent of this. Your homes are structurally sound, but there are problems that must be resolved. I assure you, my conflict is not with any of you. It is with the individuals who defrauded all of us. That night, Allison called with an update. Melanie is panicking. She's transferring money to offshore accounts and destroying documents. But here is the intriguing part. She called someone she addressed as the senator. She told him the situation was spiraling out of control. I smiled grimly. Good. People in a panic make errors. What about our federal contacts? Allison's voice was filled with excitement. The FBI agent you got in touch with? He is extremely interested. It seems they have been compiling a case against Jim Harrison for money laundering, but were unable to link him to Melanie until now. As I ended the call, my laptop chimed with an email from an anonymous source. Back off, or things will become very disagreeable for you. You don't know who you're up against. Attached was a photograph of my house in Boston. I immediately forwarded it to the FBI and texted Allison, "It seems we are unsettling the right people." Her reply was instant. "Melanie just offered me $1 million to take your evidence and vanish. Want me to accept?" I laughed aloud. "Definitely. Let's see how she intends to pay you." The following morning was a whirlwind of events. Melanie had sought an emergency injunction to prevent me from harassing residents and disseminating false information, but she had made a crucial mistake. In her rush, she had included financial documents that, in fact, corroborated my allegations. Her attorney, a flustered young man who repeatedly adjusted his tie, grasped the error too late. Judge Patricia Reeves, renowned for her straightforward handling of property law, arched an eyebrow as she examined the file. "Counselor, did you actually review these attachments before filing them?" The young lawyer, whose name tag read Kevin Marsh, blushed deeply. "Your Honor, we submitted these documents under intense time constraints." My client felt it was imperative to shield the community from Judge Reeves interrupted him. "From what, precisely? From discovering the truth about their homes? I am looking at bank records here that indicate systematic transfers from HOA accounts to offshore entities. Is your client cognizant that financial disclosures in court filings are subject to the penalties of perjury?" Melanie, seated at the defendant's table, was frantically whispering to a senior partner who had just arrived. Richard Blackstone, the notorious shark of Arizona real estate law, rose smoothly. "Your Honor, if I may step in for my colleague, there has been a misunderstanding regarding the nature of these documents." But Judge Reeves was not swayed. "Mr. Blackstone, I am not concerned with who is representing the defendant. These documents are now part of the public record. They present clear evidence of financial misconduct that justifies an investigation." Meanwhile, Melanie was acting with incredible speed. She had successfully sold 80 of the 120 homes to unsuspecting buyers, expediting closings at an astonishing rate. However, instead of halting her, I allowed her to dig herself into a deeper hole. Every sale created another victim, another individual with legal standing to sue her. Each hurried closing produced more paperwork mistakes, more proof of fraud. Allison, executing her role flawlessly, was supplying me with inside information while feigning to help Melanie conceal her activities. That afternoon, I went to the county recorder's office with a forensic auditor I had engaged, Patricia Nguyen. She specialized in real estate fraud and had previously worked with the FBI on several prominent cases. As we examined the deeds and transfer documents, Patricia let out a low whistle. "Brian, this is more serious than we anticipated. Look at these signatures." She indicated a collection of documents. The same notary on all of them, but the notary's license expired 3 years ago. Every single one of these sales is legally dubious. I examined the papers more intently and observed the timing. All these closings occurred within a 72-hour time frame. No legitimate real estate business handles this many sales so quickly without proper due diligence. Patricia nodded. "It is a clear instance of fraudulent conveyance. She is attempting to generate so many individual property claims that unraveling the transactions becomes impossible. It's a classic asset protection tactic, but executed so carelessly that it's actually producing more evidence. She's becoming desperate," Allison informed me during one of our covert meetings at a truck stop outside of town. "She's compelling buyers to close without adequate inspections, providing substantial discounts for cash payments, and I suspect she's forging signatures on disclosure forms." She gave me a flash drive. I copied everything before she could get rid of it, including emails where she explicitly directs Jim to use inferior materials to reduce costs. "Oh, and there's another thing." She produced a folder labeled Confidential. "These are internal HOA communications about something referred to as Project Clean Sweep. It seems Melanie has been planning to tear down the original section of Emerald Heights, where your aunt's house was, and construct a luxury resort. The environmental contamination was to be her justification for condemning the properties and compelling sales at prices below market value. I felt my anger surge. So, she contaminates the land, uses that contamination to evict people, and then profits from the redevelopment? Allison nodded with a grim expression. Precisely. And she has been using HOA funds to bribe environmental inspectors to ignore the problem. The corruption was more extensive than I had conceived. I spent the remainder of the day constructing a detailed flowchart of Melanie's scheme, tracing the money through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. By that evening, I had mapped out links to 3 city council members, 2 state legislators, and a federal judge. The pattern was unmistakable. Melanie had established a web of corruption that permeated every level of government. But networks possess a vulnerability. They are only as robust as their most fragile link. That evening, I got a call from Special Agent David Shin of the FBI. Mr. Jordan, we have been observing the situation. We would like to have a meeting. 2 hours later, I was seated in an unremarkable office building, gazing at a wall covered with photographs and documents, a vast network with Melanie and Jim at its core. We have been investigating Harrison for 18 months, Chin clarified. But Ross was always too shrewd, too cautious. Until now. He pointed to a photo of a distinguished-looking man with silver hair. Senator William Thornton. We suspect he has been affording them political protection in return for campaign donations. The senator, I said, recalling Allison's information. Chin nodded. Exactly. Your evidence could be the crucial element in dismantling the entire network. But we need you to undertake something risky. He detailed their plan. I would meet with Melanie while wearing a wire and propose a settlement. The objective was to induce her to confess to the larger conspiracy. She's intelligent, I cautioned. She will be wary. Chin offered a grim smile. That is why we are going to let her believe she is winning. The trap was scheduled for Friday afternoon, but on Thursday night, the entire plan nearly unraveled. Jim Harrison, who was perhaps more clever or more paranoid than we had anticipated, sensed something was amiss. He confronted Allison at the HOA office after business hours, accusing her of being a spy. The encounter escalated physically when he seized her arm. What Jim was unaware of was that Allison had been recording the entire exchange on her phone, his threats, his admission that they had handled problems like Brian before, and most damningly, his boast that the senator will bury all of you. Allison succeeded in getting away and drove directly to the FBI office. By Friday morning, we faced a new challenge. Jim had disappeared, along with $5 million from the HOA's accounts. Melanie was now beyond panic. She was desperate, which made her not only dangerous but also reckless. When I entered her office that afternoon, with a wire concealed beneath my shirt, she made no effort to be civil. What do you want, Jordan? She snapped. Her polished demeanor had vanished, replaced by a raw will to survive. I want to put an end to this, I stated calmly. You've sold most of the houses. You've made your profit. I'll accept $10 million and sign whatever papers you require. Her eyes narrowed. 10 million. You. Read illusional. But I could see her mid-working, calculating the cost against the potential risk. 5 million, she countered. And you sign a non-disclosure agreement. You never mention this again. I feigned to mull it over, then shook my head. $8 million, and I want it in cash tonight. She laughed, but the sound was hollow. Cash? What do you imagine this is, a movie? But I could see the gears turning. Cash signified no paper trail. Cash meant she could pay me using the money Jim had absconded with. I know Jim took the HOA funds, I said softly. I also know you have access to other funds, offshore accounts in the Caymans, perhaps. Her face turned pale. How do you? She stopped herself, but the damage was done. Here's how this will proceed, I went on. You are going to give me $8 million in cash. I'm going to vanish, and you are going to hope I stay gone. For a second, I thought she might challenge my bluff. Then, her shoulders slumped. Tonight, 10 p.m. The old warehouse on Route 47. Come by yourself. News of the HOA's missing money spread through Emerald Heights with incredible speed. By Saturday morning, alarmed residents were gathering in small groups, seeking answers. I organized an impromptu meeting at the community center, this time adopting a very different approach. I know you are all concerned, I started, surveying the crowd of worried faces. You have put your life savings into these homes. You are worried you might lose everything. Murmurs of consensus moved through the room. I want to assure you that my conflict is with Melanie Ross and Jim Harrison, not with you. In fact, I need your assistance to ensure that justice is achieved. I clarified the situation in straightforward terms, how Melanie had defrauded numerous property owners, how the homes were constructed on illegally acquired land, but how the residents themselves were blameless victims. Here's what I propose, I said. If you are willing to testify about any irregularities you observed, pressure to close deals quickly, missing inspections, strange fees, I will promise that your home ownership will not be contested. Furthermore, any financial damages awarded will be deposited into a fund to tackle the environmental problems and protect your property values. The reaction was astounding. 90% of the homeowners consented to cooperate. Stories came pouring out about forged documents, threats, and bribes. One elderly couple disclosed that Melanie had persuaded them to invest their entire retirement fund in a special HOA fund that promised returns of 15%. Another family found out that their home inspection had been conducted before the house was even constructed. Every story contributed another piece to the wall of evidence we were constructing. That evening, as I readied myself for the warehouse meeting, my phone rang. It was Melanie. "There's been a change of plans," she said, her voice tight with tension. "I'll arrange for someone to bring the money to your hotel." I could detect the fear in her tone. She suspected a setup. "No deal," I answered firmly. "Either we meet in person, or I go public with everything tomorrow morning." The silence on the line stretched for several long seconds. "Fine," she snapped. "But I'm bringing security." I smiled. "Bring anyone you wish. Just make sure you bring my money." The warehouse was an immense structure that had previously been used to store farm machinery. It now stood vacant, an ideal location for a secret meeting. I got there early to check for other exits and potential hiding spots. The FBI had proposed to wire the building, but I had persuaded them to maintain their distance, knowing Melanie would flee at the slightest indication of law enforcement. Instead, I was equipped with a new, state-of-the-art wire capable of transmitting through concrete walls. At precisely 10 p.m., headlights illuminated the dusty windows. Melanie came in accompanied by two large men who appeared to lift small vehicles for exercise. She was holding a duffel bag that seemed promisingly full. $8 million, she stated flatly, dropping the bag near my feet. "Check it if you like." I opened the bag, which was filled with stacks of $100 bills. "Seems about right," I said nonchalantly. "Now, about that NDA." Melanie produced a document. "Sign it, take your funds, and vanish. If I ever see you again, if you so much as utter a word about this to anyone, you'll what?" I cut in. "Have me killed, as you did with Thomas Brennan?" Her face turned a deathly pale. Thomas Brennan was a journalist who had been looking into HOA corruption 3 years earlier. His death had been officially declared an accident. "I have no idea what you're referring to," she stammered, but her security guards exchanged uneasy looks. "Really?" I took out my phone and showed her a photo. "Because I have a very compelling email in which you talk about permanently solving the Brennan problem with someone named Victor." In that instant, everything unfolded simultaneously. One of her security guards reached for his firearm. The warehouse doors flew open, and FBI agents flooded in with their weapons drawn. Melanie shrieked and attempted to flee, but there was no escape. As they placed her in handcuffs, she glared at me with intense hatred. "You framed me," she screeched. "You will regret this." "Actually," I replied, "I believe you are the one who is going to pay. By the way, the money you brought is marked." The serial numbers were documented when Jim took it from the HOA account. As they took her away, she turned for a final look. "You have no idea. This is much bigger than me. They will come for you." I observed the FBI car fade into the darkness, contemplating who they might be. But that was an issue for another time. Tonight, justice had prevailed. The news of Melanie's arrest disseminated rapidly. By the following morning, 3 city council members had stepped down, and Senator Thornton's office had released a statement disavowing any association with the Emerald Heights scandal. Of course, I thought, just as you would deny knowledge of those campaign donations. The federal courthouse was overflowing for Melanie's preliminary hearing. The government had indicted her on 37 counts, including fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and racketeering. Jim Harrison had been apprehended at the Mexican border with a counterfeit passport and had quickly cooperated with the FBI, consenting to testify against Melanie for a lesser sentence. The genuine bombshell, however, came when the prosecutor declared that they were also investigating a sitting U.S. senator for corruption. The media erupted into a frenzy. I took the witness stand on the third day, guiding the court through my investigation. The defense lawyer, Richard Blackstone, known as the Shark, was a merciless litigator who had never lost a real estate fraud case. He approached me with a predatory grin, his $3,000 suit perfectly fitted. "Mr. Jordan," he began smoothly, "is it not accurate that you harbor a personal vendetta against my client, that this entire affair is simply a sophisticated ploy to extort funds from a successful businesswoman?" I met his stare calmly. "No, counselor. I orchestrated this situation to bring to light a criminal operation that had pilfered millions from innocent individuals. The only extortion that occurred here was committed by your client." Blackstone's smile did not falter. "You profess to be a forensic accountant, yet you employ deceptive tactics, such as wearing a wire and feigning to accept a bribe. How does that differ from entrapment?" Allison, seated at the prosecution's table, passed a note to the lead prosecutor. He rose at once. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant initiated the bribe offer, as is plainly demonstrated by the evidence." Judge Carter upheld the objection, but Blackstone was not discouraged. He dedicated the next hour to portraying me as a calculating opportunist, but every one of his attacks merely gave me an opportunity to introduce more evidence of Melanie's offenses. The true turning point arrived when I introduced my legal argument. "Your Honor," I began, rising to address the court directly, "I wish to bring the court's attention to the case of Whitmore versus Henderson, 1896. Blackstone leaped to his feet. "Relevance, Your Honor. We are not here to debate century-old property disagreements." But Judge Carter was captivated. "I will permit it. Proceed, Mr. Jordan." I produced a leather-bound law book, a theatrical but effective gesture. In Whitmore versus Henderson, the state Supreme Court determined that any structure erected on private land without the owner's explicit consent becomes the property of the landowner, irrespective of the builder's investment or intentions. This legal precedent was reaffirmed in Morrison versus State in 1952, and once more in Consolidated Developers versus Williams in 1998. The courtroom fell completely silent. "Furthermore," I went on, "Arizona Revised Statute 42 to 173 explicitly states that improvements made in bad faith cannot be claimed by the trespasser. The statute specifically identifies fraudulent conveyance of property rights as a basis for forfeiture." Blackstone was hastily looking through his notes. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. These are outdated laws that have not been invoked for decades." Judge Carter leaned forward. "Actually, Counselor, Whitmore versus Henderson was referenced just last year in Peterson versus Maricopa County. Please continue, Mr. Jordan." I smiled faintly. "Thank you, Your Honor. By integrating these precedents with the evidence of fraud, we can demonstrate that not only did Ms. Ross engage in criminal behavior, but she also unintentionally transferred ownership of all improvements, all 120 homes, to me as the legitimate landowner." The prosecution team appeared dumbfounded. Even Allison looked surprised, although we had previously discussed this strategy. Blackstone was turning crimson. "This is absurd. You cannot seriously propose that my client constructed 120 homes only to forfeit them due to a technicality." I turned to confront him directly. "It is not a technicality, Counselor. It is the law. The very law your client attempted to bend for her own benefit." Melanie seized Blackstone's arm, hissing loud enough for the court stenographer to record. "Do something. Contact the senator. Inform him that if I go down, I'm bringing everyone with me." The judge's gavel struck hard. "Order. Ms. Ross, you will cease making threats in my courtroom." But the statement had been made. Within hours, the FBI had raided Senator Thornton's office. The subsequent phase of the trial centered on environmental fraud. I presented evidence demonstrating that Melanie had bribed inspectors to ignore contamination that rendered the land unfit for residential use without substantial remediation. "The irony," I explained to the court, "is that in her haste to make a profit, Ms. Ross exponentially increased her liability exposure under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. She is now personally liable for cleanup expenses estimated at $30 million. Blackstone attempted one final, desperate move. "Your Honor, even if we were to accept Mr. Jordan's interpretation of property law, which we do not, surely the innocent homeowners who acquired these properties in good faith possess some rights." It was precisely the opportunity one had anticipated. "Absolutely, Counselor." That is why I am proposing a settlement in which I sell each home back to its current resident at their original purchase price, less any fraudulent fees or kickbacks. All profits will be directed into a remediation fund and a victim restitution program. Judge Carter nodded with approval. A remarkably fair solution, Mr. Jordan. She turned to Allison. Ms. West, does your client endorse this proposal? Allison stood, embodying the role of a competent attorney. We do, Your Honor. My client's main objective has always been to secure justice for the victims of this fraud, not personal gain. The judge then addressed the prosecution. Does the government have any opposition to this framework being integrated into a potential plea agreement? The lead prosecutor rose. No objection, Your Honor. In fact, we contend that Mr. Jordan's proposal could act as a model for resolving comparable cases of systematic HOA fraud. Melanie abruptly stood, sending her chair toppling over. This is a sham trial. You are all colluding. The senator assured me of protection. He said everything was arranged. Her outburst determined her fate. The judge had her escorted from the courtroom and canceled her bail. As calm was reinstated, I presented my final piece of evidence, a thorough financial analysis that revealed how Melanie had employed a network of shell companies to launder money through the HOA. Your Honor, this chart illustrates that over the past 5 years, approximately $47 million has passed through these accounts, with patterns indicative of classic money laundering schemes. The forensic accountant in me had reserved the most compelling evidence for last. The judge declared a recess to examine the evidence. When the court reconvened, her judgment was resolute. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, and particularly considering Ms. Ross's own admissions made in this courtroom, I find there are sufficient grounds to move forward with all charges. Furthermore, I am approving the plaintiff's motion regarding property ownership, contingent upon the proposed restitution framework. As we departed the courthouse, Allison turned to me with clear admiration. That was masterful. How long have you been devising this? I smiled. Since the day I learned about Whitmore versus Henderson. Sometimes the most effective trap is the one your adversary constructs for themselves. Melanie was so preoccupied with manipulating legal details that she never imagined they could be turned against her. The evening news featured footage of Melanie in handcuffs, shouting about conspiracies as she was led away. The headline declared, HOA president's greed becomes her prison. Landmark case establishes new precedent. 3 months later, at Melanie's sentencing hearing, the courtroom was once again full. The judge's remarks were blistering. Ms. Ross, you violated the trust of hundreds of families, corrupted public officials, and demonstrated a callous indifference to both the law and fundamental human decency. This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison with no chance of parole. As the gavel fell, I thought of Aunt Margaret. Her strategy had been executed flawlessly. She had known I would uncover the legal perspective that everyone else had overlooked. Sometimes, the most satisfying revenge truly is living well. But in this instance, it was even more gratifying. It was using their own instrument against them. The remaining pieces came together over the following 6 months like a perfectly arranged symphony. Melanie Ross was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. During her sentencing, she stood before the judge, a mere semblance of her former self, and gave a statement that garnered national attention. I allowed greed to obscure my awareness of the harm I was inflicting, she stated, her voice hardly audible. I ruined lives, families, and communities. I can never fully atone for my actions, but I trust my cooperation will aid in bringing down others like me. Her testimony had, in fact, been crucial in dismantling a network that extended across 12 states and implicated over 200 corrupt officials. Jim Harrison received a more lenient sentence of 15 years due to his early cooperation. He supplied comprehensive financial records that were instrumental in recovering more than $30 million in embezzled funds. The real seismic event occurred when Senator William Thornton's trial commenced. The man who had once held immense influence now occupied the defendant's chair, confronting charges that could result in a life sentence. His downfall was as dramatic and complete as a Shakespearean tragedy, transforming him from a respected legislator to the symbol of political corruption in America. Regarding the 120 homes, the resolution was more graceful than anyone had anticipated. I sold each house back to its current resident for precisely what they had initially paid, deducting any kickbacks or fraudulent fees they had incurred. The environmental remediation was carried out using funds recovered from the criminal enterprise. The land's value surged once the news of the natural gas deposits became public, but I had already made other plans. The mineral rights were placed into a community trust, with the profits designated to support local schools and environmental conservation programs for the next 50 years. Connell Lewis, my childhood neighbor who had become an HOA victim, was elected as the new president of the community association. His first official act was to amend the bylaws, guaranteeing transparency and mandating a supermajority vote for any significant decisions. Never again, he remarked to me over coffee one morning. We are going to establish a genuine community, not a fraudulent scheme. The residents, who had once been wary of one another, had formed a strong bond through their common ordeal. Block parties took the place of HOA meetings, and a community garden thrived where Melanie's office had once stood. Allison West's career path was transformed almost instantly. The young lawyer who had been blacklisted became the leading authority on property fraud. She established her own law firm dedicated to safeguarding homeowners from predatory HOAs and corrupt developers. Within a year, she had offices in 3 states and a lengthy waiting list of potential clients. "I owe everything to your aunt," she confessed to me one day. She recognized something in me that was worth preserving. We had discovered more of Aunt Margaret's letters concealed on the property. She had been documenting Melanie's activities for years, constructing a case that she knew she would not live to see through to completion. Former Judge Harold Winter's testimony had uncovered another layer of corruption. His detailed descriptions of judicial malfeasance prompted a large-scale investigation by the Department of Justice. 17 judges in 6 states were indicted, their cases were re-examined, and hundreds of unjust foreclosures were reversed. Winters passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 months after giving his testimony, finally at peace with his conscience. His funeral was attended by many of the families he had assisted in his final act of atonement. The repercussions continued to ripple outward. States began to enact new legislation to shield property owners from HOA overreach. The Jordan Amendment, as it came to be called, mandated multiple forms of verified communication for any HOA action that impacted property rights. Law schools introduced courses on HOA governance and property fraud. The Emerald Heights case became standard reading in ethics classes, serving as a cautionary tale of how unchecked authority and greed can corrupt entire systems. On the anniversary of Melanie's arrest, I stood in the community center, speaking to an assembly of residents, local officials, and members of the press. "This triumph is for all of us," I declared, looking at the faces that had grown familiar over the past year. For everyone who took a stand, spoke up, and refused to let corruption prevail. For my Aunt Margaret, who foresaw this and laid the groundwork for justice. And for this community, which opted for unity over discord and truth over expediency. After the speeches, as people mingled and exchanged stories, I found myself standing where my aunt's wildflower field once was. It was now a playground filled with the laughter of children. Their parents watched from nearby benches, no longer troubled by mysterious fees or the threat of foreclosure. Connell approached, offering me a cold beer. "You know, Brian, when you first arrived, some of us saw you as the adversary. Now, look at this community." He gestured toward the flourishing neighborhood. Sometimes, the most satisfying revenge truly is living well. As the sun descended over Emerald Heights, I reflected on the journey from that initial shocking morning to this moment of tranquility. The forensic accountant in me appreciated the tidy resolution of debits and credits, with justice rebalancing the scales. But the human part of me derived a deeper fulfillment from the community that had risen from the ruins of corruption. As I walked back to rejoin the festivities, I could almost discern Aunt Margaret's voice carried on the evening breeze. "Well done, Brian. Well done indeed." The wildflowers were no more, but something even more beautiful had established itself, a community founded on trust, transparency, and the unwavering conviction that justice, although sometimes postponed, will invariably find a way to triumph. Looking back, I realized Melanie had been correct about one thing. She had indeed fallen into a legal trap. However, it was not one that I had constructed. It was one she had built for herself, piece by piece, with every falsified document, every forged signature, and every family she had attempted to ruin. Ultimately, the very laws she had distorted to fuel her greed had recoiled like a stretched rubber band, administering the kind of poetic justice that constitutes the best sort of conclusion, the kind where the virtuous prevail, the wicked pay their due. And a community learns that together, they are more resilient than any corrupt system that seeks to undermine them.